Hello, good afternoon. I'm Kyle Pope, editor and publisher of the Columbia Journalism Review. So happy to be here and happy that you're here to join us for day 2 of our new journalism conversation. Yesterday, we had a terrific exchange looking at the problems that journalism faces and what isn't working. Today, we're switching course to hopefully what will be a slightly more optimistic and upbeat conversation about what we want the world to look like in journalism and how we want to rebuild it. I'm really happy to be joined by this group of people who can help us imagine what we should keep, what we should not keep, and how we move forward. That'll be followed at 3 o'clock by an additional conversation moderated by Jelani Cobb about how do we hold the industry accountable to what we're going to be talking about here. So my job is just to step back and introduce the moderator of this session, Emily Bell, my colleague at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, which does amazing work chronicling the toll of the decline of journalism and really understanding data that drives our industry. I'm happy to turn it over to Emily, and I look forward to listening. Thank you so much. Emily.
Thank you very much indeed, Kyle. And hoping that I will, here we are, yes, my fellow panelists will magically appear. It's so great to be here. I know you hear that a lot on Zoom calls, but I'm genuinely excited about this one because we have 3 people here today who both at, if you like, a structural, like a really big level can think about the problems of journalism. Somebody who has direct recent experience of really kind of making new models work at institutional level, and someone who thinks a lot about what do we do at format at storytelling level. So I just want to kind of introduce those panelists. So first, with our 30,000 foot view, is my dear friend and collaborator Ethan Zuckerman, who is professor at the University of Amherst, though he's actually visiting Columbia this semester at the Knight Institute for the First Amendment, where he's a visiting scholar. Though he's actually in Western Massachusetts, just to confuse everybody geographically. Ethan probably has been the person I've followed most closely on every question about the future of journalism for the past 20 years. Not just because he has amazing insights, not just because he worked with an incredible set of people for a decade at the Center for Civic Media, MIT, where he was until earlier this year, but also because he's a doer. And many of you will know Global Voices, which he founded with Rebecca McKinnon. He's worked outside, if you like, the kind of the confines of thinking of most journalistic organizations to really experiment with new models. He's also the instigator of the first ever pop-up ad, but we mustn't hold that against him, and he uses that as a great example of things that perhaps we want to leave behind. So welcome, Ethan. It's so great to have you here.
Great to be here as well.
And next we have, I'm so thrilled that we have Sierra Hinton here, who is a kind of an inspiration in her current role as executive director publisher at Scalawag, which is a journalism and storytelling organization. I think that's how you describe it, isn't it, Sierra? Which addresses audiences in the South. And Sierra's background, thankfully, is not in journalism, but she brought a lot of lessons that she learned in other areas of civic engagement around education into how we should think about rebuilding journalism. And what she's been doing at Scalawag is truly remarkable, not just reorienting an organization to be financially viable and sustainable, but also thinking really hard about how do you address different audiences? How do you get communities that need and deserve this high quality coverage but that might have been dissociated from it in the past. So that's great. And then finally, my friend and collaborator, sometimes occasionally co-teacher, though we haven't done that for a while. I think they've split us up for good reason. Du-Lin Tu, who's a professor here at the Columbia Journalism School. He's also an award-winning filmmaker and journalist, and he's author of a book called Narrative Storytelling for Multimedia Journalists, which I urge you to. Can they still order it on Amazon? Do. You're going to have to unmute.
There might be 1,000 or 2,000 copies left, so yeah.
Okay. And so Du spends, when he's not teaching our journalists excellent techniques and to think about how they might produce video formats, he also thinks about where the field is going in terms of that. And he will not, it has to be said, utter the words pivot to video. He's the least pivot to video journalist that I've ever met. So I'm going to start everybody by that question that Kyle posed at the top, which is, from your perspective, what are the things that we want to keep from where we are at the moment? And what are the things that we want to leave behind? And what are the things that we want to build? So, you know, this is a kind of a builder session. So Ethan, I'm going to start. I'm going to sort of take it from the big picture to the specific to the format. So I'm going to start with Ethan and then come to Sierra and then go to Du. So easy ones first, Ethan. What do we do?
So I like this model of what do we want to keep, what do we want to leave behind, and what do we want to build. So let me offer three really quickly. I think for all that we grouse about the current moment in media, and I want to acknowledge the ways in which there's financial catastrophe and local journalism is falling apart, and the spread of stories on digital media does seem to be pushing us towards political extremes. One thing that is really remarkable about this moment is that we are hearing from a much wider range of voices. And I think no matter what happens, we can't lose track of that. Whether it's having a publication like Scalawag that shows up explicitly as an anti-racist publication, giving a different perspective from the South, whether it's a publication like Global Voices, which says, look, there's people with stories to tell to the world about what's going on in their home countries, and it doesn't need to be told through the lens of a foreign correspondent. We simply should be doing a better job of listening to people on the ground. We have radically expanded the range of people who are able to speak. What we have done very poorly at the moment is thought about this battle for attention. And so what's happened instead is we have this incredible weaponization of attention. We are all trying to grab at scarce bits of attention, whether it's the clickbait headlines, whether it's different ways of getting stories in front of us, like the 73 urgent news announcements from the New York Times every day. We are doing a very, very poor job of thinking about that scarce resource and how we are sort of using it up from our readers. As far as the big picture, I went out of the business of solving journalism 5 or 6 years ago. I kind of threw my hands up. The big picture that I am trying to work on right now is solving social media. And I do think the two are very deeply connected. And my very quick version of that is that we have to stop looking for giant millions of people at a time solutions. Fixing Facebook, fixing YouTube, those things are unlikely to be fixed all at once by a number of people. Actually, what we need to do is think about much smaller communities and smaller communities that can govern themselves. And so that's where I'm going on sort of my work on social media. And I wonder in many ways if that isn't where we need to be going on journalism as well. Much smaller scope of projects and people actually buying into them, not just financially, but also in terms of running them and managing them. I think that's going to turn out to be the solution to local journalism that turns out to be consistent with the first thing I said, which is that we want to do this in a way where we're hearing a much more diverse range of voice.
I think that's a fascinating point, Ethan. I'm going to come back to it later, but just that point of scale, I think, is one that we should really, because we're talking about rebuilding. The title of this session is Rebuilding from the Ground Up. And I think, you hear lots of sort of speculative solutions to this, but just starting with that really practical question of, how big does an organization have to be? Do people deserve having reporters in their communities? Those kinds of questions. So Sierra, a good point to come to you here at Scalawag, and welcome to CJR webinar. If you haven't done one before, it's a baptism of fire. So tell us a little bit. Answer that question as well for me, which is and do it a little bit in the frame of what you've been doing at Scalawag, which is what have you discovered about the things that you need to take forward and the things that you actually kind of like needed to change, or you think need to change to make organizations like yours successful?
Totally. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation. When I think about what we ought to keep, I immediately go to audience journey and the funnel discipline, which I know is very specific, but I think it is also super important for thinking about how do we take folks from awareness to loyalty. And it's something that we go back to at Scalawag over and over again. I think what changes is as we get more data and as we can be more insights driven, we're thinking about how we alter the interactions that we have with folks at each step of the funnel to get them to the next step faster, or to bring more folks from one part of the funnel to the next part of the funnel. So again, I know that's very specific, but I think it is something that's really important, especially as we think about what are the ways that we can make the work of journalism and the work of running a news business very plain for folks, especially folks who want to come in and start up their own news organization. What are the tools that we can give them so that they know what it looks like to do this successfully, and what it looks like to be able to do this in a way that's sustainable and can scale. And that's just a tool that has been really, really helpful for us. And there are others, but that's the one that I wanted to focus on. When I think about what we need to let go of, I know that there's been a lot of conversation about the rejection of objectivity, but I think it's time to, and so yes, we should definitely let go of objectivity, but I also think we need to take it one step further and think about how do we actually operationalize the rejection of objectivity in our content and in our reporting. So with this, I think a lot about our coverage of mask protests around the country, and something that I've really noticed and something that, we really try not to replicate in our reporting at Scalawag is the absence of identity and how identity plays a role in how we report on what's happening. And what has been, I think, even more interesting and maybe another layer is when we think about the identity of folks who are attending these mass protests, and we think about how folks report on them, they are identified as conservatives or Republicans or in support of Trump. They are identified as low income sometimes, or from rural communities or from the South. But they very rarely do folks talk about how they are white, and how that identity plays a role in them showing up to these protests, and what is really, I think, a show against collective, just our collective protection of each other. And that's the point that we're really trying to drive home with wearing masks, right? It's not just about protecting yourself, but also protecting your neighbors. And how does white supremacy and individualism as a part of white supremacy perpetuate this thought that I don't have to wear a mask, I don't have to think about my neighbors and the other people in my community, and how it's important to break that down to get that sort of level of understanding so that there's a larger conversation about why folks are protesting wearing masks. But when we don't identify white supremacy in our reporting and we gloss over it or we ignore it altogether, there's not that historical context, there's not that social context that helps folks understand how white supremacy shows up in what we're in, how we live our lives, and therefore it makes it harder to deconstruct it and decenter it. When I think about what we should be moving toward, I think it is, and I'm of course not the first person to say this, but a theory of change for journalism. At Scalalag, our theory of change is central to everything that we do. And, you know, I just very quickly, our theory of change is that if we produce community-driven reporting and are in constant reciprocal relationship with our community, we will be providing news and information that folks need that directly addresses what's happening around them, but also news and information that can equip them to be a part of social movement in their community and beyond. And that is how we will start to see change and a shift to a more just South, to a more just region. So, you know, individual newsrooms, but also the collective industry, what is our theory of change? Like, how is the work that we're doing contributing to making a more just nation and world?
I think that's great. We've already got a couple of questions rolling in, which actually pick up directly on things that you said there, which I think are like super interesting. One of the things that interests me, you know, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is that, you know, I'm old, so I've been looking at this for a very long time, and we went through a phase of only discussing innovation in terms of product and revenue. And I think that this time round, your theory of change point, Sierra, is right on point, which is, you know, whilst there are always people like Ethan saying, yeah, but what about actually rethinking how we cover the world? That was never at the front and center really of some of the bigger kind of, oh, you need to, you know, pivot to video, you need to do this, you need to do that. I think the really interesting and very kind of energizing thing about the moment we're in is that the discussions that you've just been talking about are becoming the central discussions rather than peripheral to some kind of, you know, change in production line or whatever. So talking of pivoting to video, I'll pivot to Do here. Storytelling Do is one of those kind of things where you and I have spoken a lot over the years about our skepticism about some of the what journalists are told they need to do, etc., and how often that ignores what audiences are doing, etc. What are you thinking in terms of this? What are we keeping? You know, what are we changing? What do we want to do in the future?
Yeah, and that's a great question because, you know, as a practitioner of journalism, but also a professor, you know, when it comes on the curriculum, I constantly have to think about what do we teach the next generation and the students and in a very concrete way, right? I have this X number of weeks to get a limited number of points across. And the good news is that, you know, the traditional aspects of the act of journalism are the same, you know, reporting, verification, speaking truth to power, exposing malfeasance, giving useful information to your community. Those things are, you know, we still teach those. So at the heart of that, you know, just the act of journalism, you know, it's this strong. But to your point, what does that look like is the bigger question. And I think what we need to start doing as journalists or as an industry is having kind of an honest talk about our relationship to audience. And what I mean by that is that we kind of cherry pick, are we journalism or are we media? And I oftentimes they'll, you know, on Twitter, you'll see, oh my God, media is messing up coverage of Trump again. They're going to do the same thing as 2016. And then my very dear journalistic colleagues will circle the wagons and go, no, that's not all. It's not all media. It's journalism's not all media. We're our own subset. And that's not a really honest, you know, assessment of our relationship with our audience. Our audience doesn't go, oh, you're journalism, you're media, you're nonfiction, you're breaking news. Like, they don't really break it down into those slivers. So we have to have a really understanding that we're swimming in a pool of this thing called media and content and words and video, whatever your form is. And unfortunately for us, people define us the way they want to define us. So on the next step, as we go forward, we kind of have to accept that, instead of just saying, which we kind of do as journalists, we kind of dig in our heels, like, you know, we're the experts, we're the journalists, we're going to give you what you need, and the other people, they're not. And we've always had this when we talked about, you know, citizen journalism or any of that stuff. You're not us, but the world doesn't see us like that. And I think we have to have, moving forward, an honest discussion of the pool that we swim in, and how, in fact, can we differentiate ourselves in a meaningful way, not just because we said we're different. And secondly, how can we be more respectful of what, as you and I always talk about, what the audience is really doing and engaging in, as opposed to what we think they should engage in, because we're so egomaniacal sometimes about what we think is right. So, you know, the standards of journalism, I can tell everyone watching this, thumbs up. My students love it. They love reporting. They love verification. They love interviewing. They love speaking truth to power. They love going to neighborhoods with people that don't look like themselves, so they can understand that a little bit better. So on that point, but as they go into the professional world, I think it's an opportunity for them to not repeat the mistakes that our generation of journalists have done. So that's the thing I'm looking forward to.
And that, I mean, that sort of picks up again on both Sierra and Ethan's points about, you know, kind of scale, objectivity, like what is it, how are you meant to act as a journalist now? Because I think that we've seen so many sort of tremendous changes in the environment that we operate in, that when we talk about rebuilding from the ground up, I think you're absolutely right, that we don't, you know, it's easy to forget how different everything about how we operate and how we live is now from how it was 25, 30 years ago, or even kind of 10, 15 years ago. So Ethan, sort of, you know, on those points, and you say you're looking at sort of fixing social media, and that has to be a big part of how we fix journalism. And a lot of what Sierra was saying is kind of situated in that world, right? Which is, it's doesn't tolerate objectivity or, you know, false objectivity in the same way. It creates an environment that you don't necessarily have much control over. What do we think? You know, we talk about scale as being the problem. Can you unpack that a little bit for us about, you know, what are the things that we need to fix for the kinds of journalism that, you know, Sierra does here to thrive?
So I want to pick up on something that Dew was talking about, which is this idea of distinguishing between news and media. And I just don't think it's possible at this point. I think we can absolutely have practices within our newsrooms where we're committing ourselves to fact checking and certainly towards truthfulness. I agree with Sierra that I think letting go of the view from nowhere and sort of a stance of objectivity is also a move in the right direction. But any conversation that we're having that isn't acknowledging that, you know, the big television networks no longer really have a huge audience. YouTube has an enormous audience. That everyone is responding to news by being part of the commentariat, and we're sending it back and forth and amplifying the parts of it that we like and that we don't like. Anything that is looking at news independent from social media, from Google search, from the web of advertising and targeting around this is fooling themselves, right? We're in this much, much more complex ecosystem. We are fighting over our attention at all times, and it's being pulled both by very high quality content as well as by very low quality content, as well as by our neighbors reflecting on how much it sucks to have kids in kindergarten during pandemic. What I think we have not talked very much about is how these new spaces are governed. So there's a lot of us talking about right now the incredible power of Google, the incredible power of Facebook. And we talk about asking those companies to do better. We talk about asking governments to regulate them. the other way that we could look at this is say that it's absurd to pretend that there's a community of 2 billion people on Facebook. 2 billion people isn't a community. There's no nation on earth that has 2 billion people. A community tends to be somewhere from 20 to maybe 20,000 people. And communities govern themselves. They have laws, they have norms, they have ways of having conversations about what's allowable behavior, so on and so forth. We have outsourced all of that. We've sort of said, hey, Facebook, you take responsibility for how we talk to one another, how we share news and information, and write it up in a book that none of us can see and hand it to moderators in the Philippines, and I'm sure everything will be just fine. And we're now sort of finding that it doesn't work real well. What we actually need is to take responsibility for governing the conversation spaces that we're within. So Sierra's talking about how Scalawag is sort of building a base of users who have loyalty to the content, to the point of view, toward the way storytelling is going, towards the larger mission of an anti-racist site that's actively countering white supremacy. We need to be thinking about having communities that have rules, that have values, and that have governance associated with that. And I actually think that's a way that we start figuring out how to revitalize journalistic institutions. Journalism at the end of the day is providing a service. It's providing ways for us as citizens to understand the world that we're working in and to try to figure out how we put forward our perspectives and try to steer the ship and exercise levers of power. If we can find ways to make community spaces and maybe eventually journalistic spaces, spaces that we as participants help govern, it's a huge victory for small d democracy. It gets us all thinking about how we are actively involved in governing those spaces that we're a part of. And in the long run, what we need, what we prioritize becomes part of the mission of that larger project, whether it's community or journalistic. I have all sorts of thoughts about how we actually go ahead and build this. I don't want to dominate, but I do want to suggest that one of the things that we have to do is stop trying to fix these organizations that are serving hundreds of millions of us. It's very hard for us individually to fix them. We are so much better off starting small communities around a different set of values and principles and demonstrating that there's a different way to do this than what we're doing right now.
So I want to try, I'm going to come to Sierra and ask you about that, because I went on a long walk for me, which meant that, I left my building. But I was thinking about this morning, trying to sort of clear my head. And, one of the things that occurred to me, which has been said in lots of different ways at lots of different times, is that, we've spent 2 decades talking about innovating in journalism and finding new models and making this work. And when I was at The Guardian kind of like 20 years ago, we were working on this and the same things seemed to come up over and over again. But we seem to be operating in this environment, and Ethan, put his finger on it with, these massive kind of companies that we need governance structures for, and we need to create new communities within those. But it occurred to me that, one of the things that all of this talk about innovation has masked is that it's actually really hard to start something like that which is good, and actually really easy to start something like that which is bad. And we're seeing that at the moment. So Sierra, if you're feeding into that governance picture that Ethan is talking about, what are the things on a daily basis that you have, a newsroom of like 6 people or something, what on a daily basis are the things that we could change that means that doing good work that you do becomes easier, and the bad work that other people moving into this space who are not providing great services for their communities, what kind of stops them from flooding the zone, as it were?
Yeah. This sort of reminds me of a question that we've gotten a lot recently, which is like, what is Scalawag's DEI policy? And we don't have a DEI policy. Instead, we do our work through a radical Black queer feminist lens. So that means that everything that we're doing is running through this praxis, which, to Ethan's point, is aligned to a set of values that we all have an understanding of and know how to operate from. And so that is what I would offer to folks. Like, have you actually had a conversation in your newsroom around what are your values? What are your values as individuals? What are your values as a collective? How do those values play out in your work, in your reporting, and how you are relating to your audience and community? And I think I see that as really the gap between, the type of journalism that we do at Scalawag and the type of journalism that is and reporting that is coming out of these larger publications that you're referring to, Emily. They're not, being driven by values. They're not being driven by mission. And a lot of that has to do with, alignment to the dominant culture and really not, because of privilege, not really having a need to critically examine how you're perpetuating white supremacist culture and systems. But because our newsroom is diverse, we are 50% of us are people of color. We are 50% queer. So, we have these marginalized identities that really necessitate just the decentering of dominant culture and being values aligned and thinking about folks' identities and what that means for how they show up and what that means for our work. And so that's what I would offer to other folks, is to really begin to have those conversations, which it feels like we're heading toward that moment as folks really start to think about, DEI and what that means to think about DEI in their newsrooms and in their organizations. But I would push people to go even deeper and not just think of it as a training or a policy or, some of these more surface level things that can act as Band-Aids, but really like, how are we digging into how we're showing up in the world and how do we decenter white dominant culture and other dominant cultures in the process.
So one thing I want to ask you about that, just in terms of that relationship that you have with your audience, is it, so one of the things that we come across in our research a lot is like who kind of holds that relationship and how hard it is for news organizations, particularly community-based news organizations, to have that relationship directly as opposed to, say, through Facebook or, in a different, on a third-party platform. How do you think about that at Scalawag? Do you mind who kind of mediates your contact with your audience? Do you want to, like, how do you keep a hold of that, just practically keep a hold of that relationship?
Yeah, so for us, we have a collective governance model and structure. So even though like I'm the publisher, I'm the executive director, we make decisions together collectively as a team. And so no one person on our team holds that relationship. Folks are owners or managers of certain parts of the work. And so there might be someone who is more intimately involved with audience development and building relationships with our communities and audiences, but we're all a part of that work. And so, I think that goes from how we manage our social media accounts and our presence there and connecting with folks there to how we show up at our events, which have played a really big role in how we have grown relationship with community. Another thing that I will add is we don't do this by ourselves. We look to our movement partners and community organizers that we're in relationship with to help us hold relationship with community. As folks who are doing that work day in and day out, they really have an understanding of what's happening on the ground and what folks need. And, by working with them, we're able to build relationship with community faster and go deeper, but also they help us really think about how what's happening on the ground can drive our content to make sure that it's responsive.
Right, and so one of the things you have talked about with Scalawag is how you changed the audience. So you were saying, like, you know, you had an 80% white audience, and that was like, you have to change that to show that you're kind of fulfilling your mission. And how are you? What sort of progress are you making with really changing those demographics that you're addressing?
Yeah, so we've seen a great amount of growth in the diversification of our audience, particularly because we did pick up events as a strategy. Right. And that allowed us to get our team in front of people and for them to see that our team is actually a lot more diverse than it once was. Scalawag was co-founded by 3 white folks, and now, as I said, it's a much smaller team than when it started. It also started volunteer-based. Now everyone is paid. Our team is smaller, but it is a lot more diverse. So being able to show up in spaces, our strategy around events, we have hometowns. So that's another thing. Instead of trying to build relationship across the whole South, we decided we're going to start in these areas and build really deep relationships and then scale from there and go to other places. So yeah, that has helped a lot for folks to be able to see us, to build relationship with us, and then next time bring somebody else along. And so, you know, our events are, all of our events are at least 50% people of color. A lot of our events have been 60% queer. A lot of our events have been predominantly working class folks. And so we're really starting to see that shift. And also, you know, really thinking about events as not just a strategy for revenue or a strategy for membership conversion, but also as a new way of delivering our content, understanding that different modes of content delivery reach different audiences. And so, you know, people of color aren't necessarily reading, I think, email at the same rate as maybe white audiences. So how are we delivering our content in a way that more readily matches what folks are used to around receiving news and information in their community?
Right, right. That's so do when it comes to, yeah, when it comes to those formats, just kind of like tying up that sort of idea of scale, etc. You know, the kind of, I remember a phase, I'm not sure that it ever really was a phase at Columbia where J-Schools would talk about, you know, the importance of reach and getting your work seen by as many people as possible, you know, the kind of the blight of virality, or maybe, you know, the kind of gift of virality. How do we kind of think about that on a daily basis? Because it is, you know, I've become increasingly obsessed by the stories that like only kind of like 20 people read, but that are actually really, really important, and how they can be totally erased from workflow. But at the same time, you know, journalists want to be seen, they want their stuff consumed. What is it?
Yeah.
What are you telling students about that?
I mean, that's a great question, and it connects directly to what Ethan was talking about before in terms of, you know, governance. So we talk about governance, we talk about bad behavior, but we're victimized by that bad behavior because we don't control the platform, right? We don't control Facebook, and the whole pivot to video that you mentioned before was because someone said you'll get more money with video, so newsrooms went scrambling to produce more videos. So as much as we you know, want to have good governance or even self-governance, if the platform dictates us to move in a certain direction, we sometimes blindly go there. Also, to your point, Emily, I think a lot of times with this idea of getting our stories out there, we kind of outsource that. We're like, well, we'll write the story and then Twitter will do it for me, or we'll write the story and or you know, Facebook will do it for me, which you know, House Center has done wonderful research on that. And I think one of the many regrets I've had in my career, probably the biggest one was that, why didn't I invent Instagram? As a visual journalist, my goal is to quickly take a picture, easily send it out to a ton of people, right? And I think we always were in the mode of you know, we want these good things, but we don't actually want to do the things that make the good things, if that makes sense, right? So I think what Sierra is doing, she's building a community, and you often talk about platforms, you know, and I can't wait to read all your research, Ethan, about how we actually have governance when we don't actually build the thing. And I think you know, I always think back against the Instagram, I should have built the thing, because it would have been, I could have controlled it. I could have hopefully not been evil. I could have hopefully helped journalism do the thing. And so I think what we teach our students is that it's important. Where I think, you know, as progressive as we want to be, we still talk about the importance of their Twitter handle, about, you know, building their brand, and, you know, and less. So I think we mentioned that, but that's still important to us. But I think that the risk is repeating the same mistakes, because Twitter can switch an algorithm and we're done. So I think what we as an industry have to do is not, I agree with everyone on here, like governance, we need to have that, but that's so inextricably tied to the platform that I think we have to be smarter about what that thing is. And Sierra, you're talking about, oh my God, your platform was a live event, right? Our events. So you create that platform and you control it, and that becomes yours. And I think we have to do less of outsourcing of getting our audience, getting our stuff to our audience.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with that has just been the pure economics of it, and that's something we haven't talked about, the ugly business of money and support. But again, you know, kind of, you only have to look at what VCs fund to see that it's actually much easier to do bad things well than it is to do good things well. I want to come to some of the questions now, because we've got some great questions here. Which there's a very specific one actually that Roger Wilson has asked, which says, who says, what ratio of journalists and citizens do we expect to develop in local civic news media? And what does that imply for the required revenue per citizen and per customer? I don't know that whether we can get to the ARPU of that. Maybe we can. But this is something that sort of obsesses me, right? Which is that platforms often say, well, look, you don't really need local journalism. You have Nextdoor. You don't really need local journalism. You have a Facebook group. And then sometimes you get local journalism outlets that have no presence, no physical presence in the areas that they cover, because they do it algorithmically. And it's made me really think about, Sierra, your point, and Ethan, yours, about scale and about how you connect and what communities need, and also kind of like what they deserve, right? So, you know, kind of, we send plenty of human beings to press conferences at the White House. We might, if we think that local communities can be covered algorithmically, but we have to send thousands of people to cover important people, that says something, I think, sort of very kind of wrong about the industry. But that's a great question about citizens and journalists sort of ratios. I don't know who wants to pick that up. I know that kind of you all have. I know Ethan and Sierra, you both have direct experience of that. Ethan's looking.
So 723 to 1. No, I mean, I don't think anyone's gonna put a number on this. I will say my first job in journalism was reporting for the Lewisboro Ledger in a town of about 4,000 people, and small weekly newspaper. And honestly, if you looked at the content produced in the paper, roughly half of it was produced either by volunteers or people who, for all practical purpose, should have been volunteers, right? You know, the theater reviewing was getting $10 per show. The restaurant reviewer was getting $20 per restaurant. You know, outside of big cities, small newspapers often have a mix between citizen journalism and professional journalism. And frankly, it's been like that for 50, 60, 100 years. It hasn't always been a full-time profession for sort of everyone involved with it. One of the things that is potentially interesting about this moment is that more people can get involved with covering more things close to home. One of the things that is really hard with that is that it's hard to convince anybody that they want to go out and cover the school board meeting. I will tell you, the people who do want to go out and cover the school board meeting are people who have issues that they care about in front of the school board. And this is one of those things where I think we need to think not only about citizens, but also about activists, people who are passionately concerned with the issues that are on the table are often the people who are willing to put time and energy and money into sort of finding ways to cover things. I am not suggesting that we replace the LA Times or the Washington Post with a slew of volunteers. What I am saying is that we've done remarkably well at Global Voices with a combination of people who are able to work full-time and sort of put their time into this, people who are able to work for fairly modest stipends, which help them pay for connectivity and things along those lines, and pure volunteers, where the unifying force is passion. It's excitement about changing how your country is represented on a global stage and reaching an audience in one fashion or another. I think in many ways, when we get into these conversations about the future of journalism, what we're really talking about is saving jobs. And saving jobs is important, but if it's the first thing we put forward, it can put us away from really having a more radical conception of what we're doing. For me, the radical conception of what we're doing is many, many, many more people making the news and being involved with the conversation about it, even if at the end of the day, we end up with the same or maybe even fewer people doing this as a full-time job, but a much wider range of people sort of involved with it.
And we need the filters and the distribution mechanisms that also meet that challenge. So that, to me, feels like a part of this, which is, has to be, that's the part that you need to fix.
And responding very directly to do, I am absolutely talking about groups taking responsibilities for their platforms, right? So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is looking very closely at Reddit. And Reddit has a platform owned by the central company, but it's also got subreddits that have their own rules, norms, and in some cases technical affordances that are agreed to by the moderators and the people who agree to be part of that community. You can push further in that direction. You can imagine having software written where then people can sort of say, okay, I'm going to turn on these features. We're going to have these affordances in this community. We're going to have a conversation about what our norms are, how we enforce those norms, how we structure that conversation. At that point, you are invested in that platform in a very different way than we are invested right now in Facebook or in Twitter. I am also not a pure utopian. I don't believe that we're going to move to these things tomorrow. Most of the work that I'm doing on this is trying to make small community experiments that are compatible and that interact with these big platforms that we have no control over. But it seems crazy to me that if we're going to try to rethink journalism and rethink our civic conversation, that we would accept as given that these platforms on which it occurs are outside of our control and, frankly, near as I can tell, uncontrollable in any meaningful way. That just seems insane.
Emily, can I just add to the local part of this, which is a little bit off topic, but I think a lot of problem with the local coverage is, and it's insane in 2020 that we still have this view that local is the bush leagues and it's the you know, the training camp for the real stuff, which is DC and New York and LA. And I think it's still many and large, you know, a lot of us still have that hierarchical thought of what journalism is. And I think it's perverted, it's weird, and I get why, because larger markets, you know, like I get that, you know, numbers wise, but if we can fundamentally change that thinking, and that starts with the journalists often themselves, that no, I don't want to leave Iowa, or I don't want to leave Louisiana, or the Midwest is my jam. Like, I think if we rethink about that, then the business models around that and the payment and the communities, I think that will align more. And I just want to add that because I think us journalists are very guilty of that, creating or helping to create that mess.
Well, and also I think that, you know, we haven't got to it yet. Maybe we will do the redistribution. There needs to be a redistribution of wealth throughout the system. That, you know, we talk a lot about innovation in newsrooms. You know, what's innovative would be paying the healthcare costs of your local reporters, you know, because that is something we haven't cracked. And actually that sort of brings me a question here from Rich Weiss. Thanks very much indeed for the question, Rich, who says, I belong to an association of 14 community media outlets, with some of our member outlets posting a PDF of their print newspaper as their website. is there a role in the future for these digitally challenged community media outlets? This is something that I feel sort of slightly passionate about, because I feel that there's been a lot of sort of, you know, kind of what I'd call transformational bullying of organizations, saying you're not doing enough, you're not moving faster. And that might be true, but it's not the only way, as it were. I don't know, Sierra, you're kind of like, you're innovating, you're very kind of like, you know, digitally savvy, but you also, I think, you know, understand that there are, people will move at different rates. So it's a good question, which is, you know, what kinds of levels of innovation do we need at the ground for these types of community operations?
Yeah, not only do people move at different paces, like in some places, they don't have access to broadband, they don't have access to the things that will allow them to go on the internet and view your content digitally. And so for us, you know, innovation really, like I said previously, goes to, okay, like how are people in this community receiving news and information? If it is a print product and we need to print off everything that we're producing and give it out to people, that's what we need to do in order to reach our audience. And so I think, you know, in the same way, that we just talked about, the sort of hierarchy of place, we also have to think about the hierarchy of product. And when we think about innovation, like innovation is not like, how can I get to the trendy thing? Innovation is like, what creative ways, how am I using my radical imagination to come up with new ways of delivering our content, of doing what we do so that it reaches more people.
There's a question here which I really want to hear from everybody on, which I think is absolutely critical, from Vanessa Maria Graber, who says, how do we get newsrooms to create content for working people and people experiencing poverty? How do we shift them to see them as valuable consumers of information and get them to meet the public's basic information needs? This is something we've done a lot of work on at the Town Centre with both rural and urban communities who are otherwise disconnected with news, I think. So, and it actually, like, just to be provocative about that, to say, you know, does everybody have to consume the news? You know, kind of like, can there be kind of services for people who don't have the time necessarily to engage with it, or the resources? But that question about how we connect those communities to information and information they need is critical. What can we do to improve that?
Emily, I just want to jump in right now because there's a very immediate parallel. In my children's school, they recently merged, they're in elementary school, they recently merged with another school that has a lower income population. And you can imagine the nightmare of reopening a school during a merger, right, during this time. And one of the biggest problems was that certain families from the lower income didn't have email addresses, right? Like there was no way of actually sending out information to them. And these are not parents who don't care about their kids. These are not parents that don't care about, you know, connecting with the teachers. They just don't have email addresses, but they would have a cell phone, right? And so they could be texted the PTA meeting information, but because of some antiquated system, it had to be emailed. So a lot was missing there. So I just want to jump in and say this idea, and it relates to what we were talking about before about the, you know, kind of the hierarchy of quality of technical tools, but something like text, right? Something like text can be very powerful. And obviously a lot of publications have learned that email is powerful, right? For reaching their audience. So I think a lot of it is the classic go to where they are, because people do need the information. I will argue people need news. If we define news as valuable information, you know, information that they need to live in a democracy, right? I think people need that, but getting it to them has to be on our shoulders. And I think we assume that most of us are like us, sitting in front of our MacBooks, you know, reading Twitter all day. And I think that's a fallacy that if we address that, I think we could help that quite a bit.
I'm noticing that we are running up to time. So I just wanted to come back to everybody very quickly for one last round, which is, if you were able to wave a wand and have one thing appear magically in the next 10 years, what would it be? I'm going to start with Ethan, because I know he thinks a lot about magic out there in the Western Massachusetts woods.
Yes, well, the fairies that waylay me on the walking trails tend to force me to think about those things. I don't want to manifest something. I want imagination. I think we fail to imagine enough and radically enough. I think even on a panel like this, where we sort of say, what if we build from the ground up? We assume many of the same institutions, many of the same roles. I think we have to think much more broadly. My new center at UMass, which is trying to sort of reimagine social media within this larger sense of digital public infrastructure, our unofficial icon is the Facebook hand holding a wrench with an X through it. I think we need to imagine not fixing Facebook or fixing YouTube or fixing Twitter. I think we have to imagine building something radically different that works for us better as individuals and as members of a society. So if I could manifest anything, it would be to get us to stop thinking on such a small scale about solutions and imagining things that feel impossible and scary when we first look at them.
Sierra, you have one thing that could come true.
I would have to completely agree with Ethan. I also think imagination is the answer, radical imagination in particular. And also agreeing with Ethan, like, I don't know why we continue to look to journalism and other organizations within the field as a model for what we do next. When we haven't been successful at doing the thing that we're trying to do. At Scalawag, we practice movement journalism, and so we look to grassroots organizing as the model for how we do our work. And so it's no wonder that we see our membership growing, that we see our audience and reach growing, because we are literally organizing folks and trying to build a community around the work that we do.
Dave?
This one, I got to agree with you, Emily. I would love to see a redistribution of wealth from the media centers to the local markets. And I think it can be done. You know, when you look at a hurricane hitting Mississippi, just the flight cost it takes to send a CNN crew down there or New York Times reporters there, you could pay 3 months salary of a local reporter there. So I think it's possible. If we just have to think, I guess, in Ethan and Sierra's terms, creatively about that, right? It's just, I think that I would love for that to happen. Excellent.
I knew you would say money. We're up to time. Kyle has appeared and we must go. I just want to thank everybody. I think we barely scratched the surface, but it was a really good scratch. And so many questions to think about. And I think that point about imagination and how can we actually just get beyond the confines of our current sort of thinking and boxes is such a great one to leave this on. And hopefully you'll all come back at some point in the future and discuss more about how we can progress that vision. So thank you all very much. Kyle, over to you.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to all of you. That was an amazing discussion. Really, really, really interesting, thought-provoking, and I so appreciate everything everybody said. Please stay tuned for everybody watching. We're going to take a short break and come back in just a couple of minutes for our final session moderated by my colleague, Jelani Cobb. So we'll be back in just a minute. Thank you so much.
Okay, and can you all hear me? All right, well, welcome. And I'm happy to be able to participate today in this conversation. My name is Jelani Cobb. I am the moderator. And our 3 p.m. session will be discussing how we hold the news accountable. And to participate in that conversation, to facilitate that conversation, I'm fortunate to have with me Bill Gruskin, who is my colleague at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, Ashton Lattimore, who is with us from PRISM, and Susan Shira, who is here with us from the Marshall Project. And I think we can just jump right into it with, well, I mean, I think this is an interesting time to have this conversation for, I think, a number of reasons. There's been, I think, a growth industry in attempts, or at least media criticism, if not attempts to hold media accountable, that has kind of correlated roughly with the rise of the Trump presidency and so on. But it's a real question, I think, about what we will take from that. I had a conversation with a highly placed person in American journalism, in American media criticism, no less. And he confided to me that he thought that the reactions that people were having to Trump were just so much hyperventilation. He said, this is, what Democrats do whenever Republicans come into power, and didn't really seem to have a vantage point on why so many people thought that this was a different situation and that journalism was called to be and to do something different. And so I guess I'll just start out. We can come back with general, more specific responses, but I'll just start out with a general question about what do you see in the landscape of accountability as it stands now, especially around the issues that people have been talking about for the previous 2 days, previous day and a half. And in addition to that, our kind of default setting has been to endure the crisis, whether that be the pandemic, the recession, all of the above, until we can return to some form of normalcy. And I wonder what you all think, about the idea of, maybe a lack of accountability being how we got to this place in the first place. So we can just kind of start and go around the horn, as they say in baseball, and we'll come back with more specific questions. Well, Ashton, why don't you give this a shot? I realize that we're on Zoom, so you can't just kind of like look over at someone and give you.
Sure. Happy to get us started. Yes, I think you're absolutely right that normal is what got us here. A lack of accountability within the media is some of what got us here. It's not all of what got us here. I think there are many factors that contributed to what the United States looks like in this current moment. But a press that is falling down on its job to hold power accountable, falling down on its job to accurately represent the lived experiences of people around the country, certainly didn't help as far as where we are now. In terms of what we've seen in accountability in this moment and for the last few years, what's been really heartening for me is to see journalists of color rising up often in their own newsrooms to hold their own colleagues, their own institutions accountable. And then you've also seen people spinning off their own outlets or creating their own outlets kind of out of thin air. Journalists from all different walks of life and all different perspectives and ways of approaching the work, who are really bringing some much needed innovation to the space and just making normal the idea that we can approach this work in a much different and much more accountable way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say that there should be no returning to normal, because normal exposed, on so many levels, right? I think the last 4 years have forced a lot of people, and COVID has just made that even clearer. And then the cascading crises of George Floyd's murder and the reaction has sort of forced people who might have been oblivious to confront the fact that they did not know and they did not see and they did not ask. And so I think that, for journalists, that's should have involved and continues to involve a lot of soul searching about who do you talk to? Where are you from? What do you know and not know? And how do you more intentionally inform yourself and make sure you're reaching communities that many news institutions, ones I've been affiliated with, notwithstanding, have failed to encompass and reach and understand. So I think, I think just like the age of cell phone videos forced some people who didn't live the experience of what happens when you're driving while Black, or walking while Black, or many other experiences. Mm-hmm. And it forced people to say, wait a minute, this is what happens, I'm looking at it. I think journalists were forced to say, how do I do a better job of hiring, promotion, retention, diversifying in every way? I won't go on now, there's more to say, but Bill will have smart things to say.
And Bill?
Well, I think accountability is a really interesting word, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it's really such a two-way street. I mean, journalists, we all pride ourselves on holding institutions accountable, holding powerful people accountable. And now we're seeing the accountability being turned back upon us, that we're being asked to be accountable for some of the decisions that we've made, whether it's in terms of hiring, in terms of how we define our communities, the communities that we're supposed to serve, the ability to promote people within our newsrooms, our accountability in terms of our sourcing. And it's been interesting to watch at least some news organizations take what are, pretty significant skills in holding others accountable and turning them 180 degrees. I would say that's a pretty incomplete and halting process, and it's a hard thing to do while COVID and the election and wildfires and that, the news cycle is a relentless beast. But that's what that word kind of implies to me, and I think it's a really interesting implication for us going forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that brings us to the question that I was going to pose next, which is, in any kind of landscape, you have some people who are better at something than others. And so I wonder, you say it's been interesting to see some newsrooms apply these ideas to themselves. Are there examples that you all think of institutions or organizations or even individuals who are better about this than others?
I can jump in, and and I think what I would say,
the amount of time that it took to formulate replies.
Yeah,
was a reply.
Yeah. My reply would be that it seems like individuals are far more likely. Individuals who often will stand outside of institutions are going to be much more likely to hold those institutions accountable. They may be journalists, but they're kind of folks who are working on their own, doing things like compiling surveys, assessing what's happened, with journalists of color who've left the industry, or working with external organizations to assess, what's happening within newsrooms in terms of their diversity efforts. And, often the answer is nothing. So yeah, I would say that there are more individuals who are out there doing this work on their own, sort of a freelance basis, than I would cite any major institution.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I mean, so this is a limited sample size, but I can say one of the newspapers I used to work at, the Miami Herald, has had a commitment to this. I feel like in ways that in no other institution where I've worked, certainly not the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, has had a commitment to this. And I've always kind of wondered why. When I was there in the 90s, I think our city desk was around 48%, the way they called it, was the non-Anglo. That was the term in the 90s, which was quite a remarkable number. And it wasn't just Cuban Americans. There were Hispanics from various countries,
well as a significant representation of Haitian and African American journalists. So it certainly didn't match the numbers of Dade County, but it was far and away by 15 or 20 percentage points at least higher. And I've always kind of wondered why that is. I've been on the board of the Lenfest Institute, which runs the Philadelphia Inquirer, which has had a lot of issues with this. And I feel like in South Florida, the reason a lot of it had to do is that the power structure of South Florida, both in terms of business and government, even by the 1990s, was heavily influenced by non-white people. And so the newspaper had to make a response to that. It was not that people at the Miami Herald were inherently less biased than others. It was that the community kind of forced it upon us, and the results were pretty admirable, at least for a time. And I don't know if that's true in other communities. Think of a place like Atlanta or Detroit, whether the news organizations there have shown much more openness or anything along those lines. But that's the sort of back the napkin calculation that I've made on that one.
Mm-hmm. Bill, I think you're making an important point about power, right? I mean, ultimately, so much of this comes down to who holds power, and therefore who do big institutions like news organizations that are often part of a power network, who do they feel is holding their feet to the fire? And,
right.
Increasingly, it should be readers or would-be readers as much as actual elected officials. But I think that's an astute call. But of course, the question is sometimes, even when, the pressure from the community has to come, and even having elected officials who are not white in power, it doesn't always translate into that demand for accountability, which is interesting too. I mean, I know of some places that I've looked at locally where the power structure could be, very non-white, but the newsrooms are still very unrepresentative of their communities. But I think it's a really important point.
Oh, okay. I thought you were about to go somewhere else.
Oh, go ahead, Jelani. Pick it up from what you thought I might have said.
No, I thought we were about to have a conversation about the New York Times.
Well, yeah, that is my previous home. And I guess I would say that, look, Dean Baquet is the first African-American to lead the New York Times. And, that did not mean, and the thing is, to really diversify a newsroom and to have leaders that are not diverse takes a long time in a place like the New York Times. So what I want to say there is that in order to really have power distributed in an equitable way at a place where the ascent is slow, you need to go back 15 or 20 years and make sure you're putting a wide range of people, women, people of color, whatever, in roles that allow them to acquire internal power, to gain the experiences to acquire internal power. So I think, it's a bit, just having someone who, in his case, is Black running the place doesn't translate into a newsroom that is immediately reflective of community or has widely distributed power that come from a wide range of groups.
Sure. I think this is a point of clarification. There's a great deal of criticism I think that the Times comes in for, very deservedly, about its approach to the current era that we're in. At the same time, there's a dynamic that happens with diversifying, especially when you have a solitary figure or one of a small number of people who actually makes it to the top of the situation or the institution, which is, I think, probably best represented by Barack Obama. It was previously, the example I would use was David Dinkins in New York City.
Absolutely.
But what that means is that while everyone is applauding and patting themselves on the back very often for the achievement, that individual is subjected to all kinds of cross currents because the institution may not have fundamentally changed. I can't say that that's the case for Dean Baquet, but I will say there are other examples that you could look at where people, and this I think applies to women, it applies to anyone who hasn't traditionally been represented in leadership of large and powerful institutions, that it's kind of like making it to the top of Mount Everest, which is the ascent is one difficulty, but making sure you don't get blown off the peak once you're up there is an entirely different kind of struggle. I wonder if we could turn to something else briefly, which is that I do an exercise with my students, which is that I ask them to raise their hands if they played a sport. And I usually do this with the larger classes, my ethics course, where I may have 40 or 50 students in a room, and most of them will raise their hand. And I'll say, did anyone play volleyball, baseball, boxing, particular array of sports? And they will, the remaining hands will be up. And I say to them, put your hand down if you're left-handed, and most of the hands stay up. And then I say, for the right-handed people, explain to me what it was like the first time you played your sport against a left-hander. And they're all like, oh, it was just screwy, it was crazy. Everything for baseball, I happen to be left-handed, but for baseball, everything is backward. Everything is doing the opposite of what you thought it was supposed to do. If you're facing a left-handed pitcher, or if you're playing volleyball against someone who's left-handed, all these kinds of things. And I say that is the metaphor for the media in the current era. Playing against left-handers, where the presumptions, the immediate presumptions of how to go about bringing the news to the public and how to go about holding people accountable, and all the kind of presumptions have been turned on their heads. And what we're looking at is really a kind of awkward attempt to hit a curveball thrown by a left-hander. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we've seen so much of the kind of cottage industry of trying to hold media accountable, particularly on things like social media. But the question at the heart of all this that I wanted to get to is, from your vantage points, how much of this do you think is taken to heart? I mean, there are some people, there's a tide of stuff that you can find at any time on Twitter or Instagram. There are establishment voices, or more established voices. Lewis Raven Wallace's book, The View from Somewhere, which is a critique of the idea of objectivity, which resonated with a lot of people who are having that conversation. And then people like Jay Rosen and Soledad O'Brien, who are respected media professionals who have had some very stringent criticisms of how media has operated. And I wonder just, how much of this do you think actually gets through? And I asked Ashton to go first. So now I will ask Susan.
Okay. Well, based on my long experience at the New York Times, I actually think a lot of it does get through. I mean, I think, look, I should say for the record, I have a lot of love and affection for the New York Times, where I spent, 38 years of my career. So I may not be the most unbiased viewer, but what I would say is that I think there's always the question in any institution, the New York Times not excluded, of good intentions and actually making things happen. I think people are kind of scalded by what they see and hear. They are rattled and they are concerned, and yet, I've been there, I was there a long time, and I watched waves of things happen and attempt to happen, and then, not as dramatic a change as people, I think, sincerely wanted. And so I think it's a much more fundamental question about why, with many well-intentioned people, the perception and the reality is there's still a long way to go. So I think it's not, certainly at a place like the Times, you have to put on a certain amount of shield, because if you read Twitter every day, you'd be like jumping off a cliff, or every hour. But I
think that's says for anyone if you read Twitter.
Right? I mean, so there is this sense where you can sort of get an overload of criticism. So you start thinking, God, everybody's favorite job is taking pot shots at a big institution or whatever. But, you have to, I think people know that journalism in many big storied institutions, has some really fundamental issues that have not been addressed even in past waves of good intentions. So I feel like people hear it and they're trying to figure out how to make a more fundamental change, how to make things stick. And I, even in my own small place that we don't have a perfect record on this, and I've been working as hard as I know how to, with the enthusiastic assent of people I work with, to make it better. And how you do that, and what systems you examine, and how you think about pipelines, and how you think, these things are very entrenched and challenging. That's not a cop-out. I'm just saying, like, I think it's one thing to hear it, and it's another thing to change.
Mm-hmm. Bill, do you have anything to add to that?
So I think, sorry, this microphone's a little off. I feel like a lot of newsrooms are kind of 10 years behind, kind of fighting what the last battle was. That the last battle was very much among a number of communities that, with very good justification, felt ignored. You need to pay attention to us. You need to be aware of us. You need to talk with us. You need to source us. You need to listen to our concerns. And I think, look, this is a very hard thing to paint a broad brush. You can find things that either back up or dispute the notion. But I feel like a lot of newsrooms, especially given their somewhat emaciated state, have taken some real steps along there. I also feel like some of them are now dealing with people who feel like it's not enough just to pay attention to us. You need to be our ally. You need to understand our cause and help promote our cause. And I think that's where some newsrooms are now feeling kind of uncomfortable. And this gets back a little bit, we had a little bit of a discussion before the meeting where we were talking about, what should we all be doing? And part of what I was sort of advocating that was that newsrooms have to stand for something, great journalists over the years, you can identify crusades and causes that they've stood for and that they weren't really ambiguous about, whether it's civil rights or healthcare or, the end of violence in certain parts of the world and that kind of thing. And I feel like in a lot of newsrooms, that's a hard conversation, often harder when it's something going on in your own community than when it's going on thousands of miles away.
Mm-hmm.
I want Ashton to talk, but I just want to leap into one thing, because I was the international foreign editor of the Times for 8 years, and I would just say that it's much easier. Foreign correspondents have always had more leeway to write with great moral passion about things that happen in other countries. And if you applied that same passion to a domestic situation, but it's unequivocal that racism is an evil. And yet I think I know exactly what Bill is talking about here. The best journalism has a moral resonance. It can be fact-based and rigorous and complex, but it has a moral resonance, in my opinion.
So I wonder, actually, so Ashton, I want to bring you in, but I want to follow up with this because it goes directly to the thing I was wondering about, which is, a couple years ago, actually, wow, because time has completely warped. This was 5 years ago. I went to the CPJ dinner, the Committee to Protect Journalists. And, it's a tremendously inspirational event for people who haven't attended it. There are journalists who are risking their lives from all over the world who come to New York for this event to be recognized by their peers. And we were talking to journalists who were being dodging bullets, literally, to report what was happening in Syria and so on. And I thought of it kind of passively as them being able to have a respite from the work that put their lives in jeopardy every single day. And then consequently, or subsequently, seeing the stance of significant parts of American media as some pretty disturbing developments happened in terms of the First Amendment, in terms of the freedom of the press and so on, not to mention other aspects of the changes we've seen politically in this country. And I was struck by the pliability and complacence of a good part of media. For example, the demands that people turn off their cameras during the White House press briefings, which I was shocked that people actually did. I really, to this day, I'm still amazed that people actually did it. I was like, you go in, you turn on the camera, you get kicked out, you come back the next day, turn on the camera, get kicked out, and that's just the drill. But people actually complied. And so the question I'm kind of getting at is, do you think it's possible that the relative freedom of the press in the United States has left American media uniquely unsuited to addressing the kinds of concerns that we have societally and as in terms of freedom of the press right now?
I think the stories that we tell ourselves about the freedoms we have make us uniquely unsuited to facing these kinds of issues. I don't know that we necessarily have all of the freedoms that we think that we have, and that goes with the press. And that's kind of what allows the rise of somebody who says, turn off your cameras when you go into the White House briefing room. There's a pervasive sense, not just through the press, that what is happening here is not what's happening here. Or if we saw the same thing happening in another country, the way that it would be reported is very different from the way that we see ourselves. So I agree there's a strong sense of complacency nationally. I don't think it's specific to the media, but it makes us particularly useless is not the right word, but it makes it difficult for us to hold power accountable in situations like that, because there's almost a resistance to even recognizing what power is doing in a moment like that.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? So another thing that I've thought about and have wondered about has been, what might a model of an accountable media look like? I know we've traditionally talked about, we've had things like public editors and so on, but it seems like we're in a different moment and that we are having to do business, quite literally, having to do business differently than we've done it in the past. And that might be carried over into the ways that we're held accountable to. So I wondered if you could just imagine for a moment and make suggestions about what this might actually look like.
I can jump back in again. I think that, and this is going back a little bit to the conversation and the things that Susan and Bill were talking about, how there's sort of this cottage industry of media holding ourselves and each other accountable. And I wonder sometimes if that isn't getting through as well, because it's looked at as sort of inter-industry sniping, just sort of a professional, internal, gossipy kind of thing. The folks we really need to be accountable to are the ones we're reporting on, the communities that we're reporting on and with and for. So what part of the accountability needs to look like is for newsrooms, for individual reporters, for editors to be in regular conversation with people who are part of these communities, whether that's done through, official channels in some way or surveys. At PRISM, we regularly send out a sounding board survey to leaders in the communities that we cover and the issue areas we cover to invite them to criticize us and criticize the rest of the media and tell us what we're getting wrong and how we can get it right. So inviting that kind of criticism, not just from each other, but from people who are, the real people who are at the heart of the stories that we're reporting on, I think is going to be a really, really important part of what an accountable media landscape will look like.
I'd love to pick up on that, Ashton, because I think that's really central. You know, when I was talking about readers, I think that's exactly what you said. Like at the Marshall Project, we try to reach communities that often have had no outreach by news media. And this would be people who are incarcerated, families of the incarcerated. It would be people who have been, you know, drawn into the criminal justice system or the immigration system, been abused by the criminal justice system. And so part of what we are trying to do is set up lines of communication so we hear from these groups that are often unvoiced about what matters to them, what they care about, and what is not covered or how they are mischaracterized. I think one thing I wrestle with is that, you know, it's an interesting dialogue when you do that for real, because one of the things that comes back is journalists have thought of themselves, and I'm a product of this era and I struggle with it too. So what some people want is not what we have traditionally been taught to think of as journalism. They may want, you know, I mean, for example, I was just at a community forum when we were doing this and listening, and people said, you know, why don't you write about happy things? And of course that's true, right? You know, this is a real criticism that, you know, a lot of people are used to seeing themselves in the news only when something terrible happens. But then you have to think, you know, what is a story as I have been taught to understand it? And how do I translate people's desires and sense of having been wronged into something that feels like a journalistic target, right? So I just think it's a good and challenging process. I mean, because it forces you to think about how can you honor that while also remaining true to your sense of, you know, exposing a wrong or shining light on an abuse or some such, right? I think it's a complex process.
I think there's a lot there, so I don't have a lot to add, but I would just say, I think that the way that the business models are changing and emerging, particularly as a lot of news organizations go to subscriptions rather than advertising, could have a pretty negative impact on some of these things. That insofar as the top people in a news organization feel, and understandably for economic reasons, that they need to bolster their subscription base and that they need to appeal to their subscribers, it can have a way of starting to narrow and to limit the number of people that you're serving and the communities that you're serving. That inevitably, you know, the people who can subscribe are often people who have more income, and maybe people who are more in line with what you've always done, and that can become a self-perpetuating issue, and it's something that actually worries me a lot. There were a lot of bad things about the old advertising model where 80% of the revenue came from advertisers, but advertisers, they just wanted a large audience, honestly, and they were happy to have a lot of people who were, you know, of all different income levels, because, you know, and so that, you know, that affected the way newsroom managers saw their audience and saw whom they had to appeal to. And I worry that now, as we get more and more focus on a more limited number of high-paying subscribers, that'll have a lot of influence that'll go counter to some of the things that Ashton and Susan were just advocating.
We've kind of zipped by. We could get into another question, but it would kind of infringe upon the time that we have for Q&A. So I'm just going to jump into this. And I think if we can, to the greatest extent possible, unless you really feel a burning need to weigh in on something, we can have one person respond to each question. We can get through as many of them as possible. And so the first one is, I appreciate tapping into the community to cover their community. Can you speak to the risk of losing reporting grounded in the journalism basics that Du spoke of by having activists report on stories? Or how do you endure that?
I don't know that you necessarily have to lose journalism basics to have somebody who might be called an activist report on a story. I think part of the conversation about diversifying the profession and making us more accountable to communities needs to be real consideration of this idea that to be a journalist, you have to be nothing else. And that you have to be completely divorced from caring about, in a deeply passionate way, maybe passionately enough to work on it in some capacity, a way, divorced from the issues that you're reporting on. So I don't see those two things as being in opposition to one another. I think people who have activist leanings or an activist bent are perfectly capable of gathering and reporting facts honestly, fair-mindedly, and rigorously. So I don't know if that's me rejecting kind of the premise of the question, but I don't think that those two things have to be separate.
It is difficult to demonstrate accountability at any real significant level when the president has a following of approximately 1/3 of the country, the members of which believe every word he says, and he says that any media that criticizes him is presenting fake news. And those media are, quote, enemies of the people. Aside from the new stressful industry of fact-checking, which I'll point out fact-checking is not a new industry, but aside from the new stressful industry of fact-checking, how can this be dealt with?
Well, I mean, it is profoundly disturbing and undemocratic to call the press treasonous. And I think we're all worried, partisan issues notwithstanding, that, you know, facts have become meaningless, and that those who are trying to present facts are demonized as having an agenda. And I do worry a lot about, look, I think there's a credible messenger issue that is nothing to do with who's president right now, right? There are many groups who don't find the news media credible for reasons that they felt they haven't been fairly represented or included. But I do believe that we are in a very, very dangerous moment about seeing the press as just another enemy instead of as a pillar. I mean, I know I'm about to get into pillar of democracy, and I want to say we failed, but I'm old enough to still believe.
Hold on long enough for me to hum the battle hymn of the Republic.
I know. That's why I stopped myself, Jelani. But I mean, I am a sentimentalist about what we should be trying to do, and what I hope and believe we try to do.
Mm. I agree that journalists and media pundits frequently demonstrate a need to be more accountable for their own or correcting someone else's false narratives and misrepresentations across themes. But journalists can't be entirely responsible for citizenry abdicating their accountability. What are your thoughts about journalists advocating that citizenry too are held more accountable for increasing their own critical thinking abilities and being accountable for acting in a collective good rather than individualist self-services, which often manifests in racist, sexist, genderist, marginalizing decisions? I think this boils down to what are the responsibilities of the public itself in being held accountable for, I think, enabling some of the dynamics that we're talking about.
And also, I guess there's a question, do journalists have a responsibility, kind of a civic education responsibility to help people understand, you know, everything from media literacy. I mean, critical thinking obviously is very important, you know, kind of basic civics and that sort of thing. And, you know, I actually do remember growing up as a kid, and that, you know, our local newspaper in Colorado would put out these little sections for kids that would explain kind of how the government works, and, you know, how a bill's made into law and that kind of thing. You know, I mean, I'm not sure how much that alone would resolve the problem, but I do feel like some of the media literacy efforts that are being done by the folks at Stony Brook and elsewhere are very admirable. And be curious to see if at some point they start having some real impact in terms of helping people develop better critical thinking skills, understanding of the way that what they read online, you know, finding ways to discern the underlying truth of it, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. We're seeing a demand from journalists of color at news outlets like the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the LA Times for equity in their newsrooms and ending racist practices in reporting. However, the management and owners have been slow to respond to the demands. What are the ways the community, who are not necessarily readers, hold these institutions accountable? In the end, communities of color and working class people suffer when the content doesn't serve them.
It's hard to disaggregate the readers from this, because I think readers are probably the best position to hold institutions accountable, because some of that is just where you take your money, where you take your readership, where you take your eyeballs. And if you're taking them to publications that aren't engaging in the kinds of practices that serve your community, then that's a choice that you should be thinking about. I think something else that communities can do, whether they're readers of these outlets or not, is to take their concerns, their issues, their stories to outlets that do reflect the kinds of things that they're concerned about. And that's not about readership. That's about being a source. You know, if something's happening in your community and you think it's important for the world to know about it, but you're concerned that the Times, the Inquirer, or somebody is not going to report it in a way that's careful or accountable or reflective of what's your lived experience, you know, take it to a different newsroom. Take it to maybe a smaller outlet who doesn't have as high a profile, but who has reporters, journalists, editors that you can trust and who've been in community with you in one way or another. Because I think part of the currency that builds power within the journalism industry is the story itself. So communities being the holders of those stories and the holders of the information can choose where to distribute that power, and they could choose to distribute it to places that treat journalists of color equitably and report accurately on communities of color.
So we have a couple of comments mixed in with the questions, and I'll just kind of give a couple of them. I generally, before I do the Q&A session, I have this disclaimer that I give. You know, a question is an interrogative sentence, a request for information, and so on, as differentiated from a statement which offers information. And we go through that whole thing. But we're not going to do this. We'll just kind of read this, and then we'll get through to some more questions. Someone added, it also doesn't have to be a false dichotomy between horrible news and, quote, something happy either. There can be rigorous reporting on how people are responding to problems, solutions journalism, and how are other places responding to the same problem? What are their results, and what can we learn from their efforts? Really important for audience engagement. So I guess that is a question.
Yeah, I'll just say, because that's in response to something I said, I agree. And, you know, in other words, you can, I think I have a lot of respect for Solutions Journalism Network and other people who have been devoting a lot of attention to this. I would say it can sometimes be very, very difficult to, for example, in criminal justice, where I'm now engaged, there's very little academic research or rigorous evaluation of what works and what doesn't. Let's look at police reform, right? So I absolutely agree that you can write about news that's constructive. You can look at what other countries have done. For example, you know, just again, staying in my lane for the moment, how other prison systems operate internationally in a very, very different and far less punitive and far more rehabilitative way than the American criminal justice system. So, but I think one of the challenges is, you know, figuring out what works beyond anecdotes. And I think that's just a good challenge and one worthy of attention.
Here's an interesting one. 7 weeks left, I presume they mean before the election. 7 weeks left. If you were running a major newsroom, what would your marching orders be? Anyone can take that one.
Oh boy.
It's too big. It's
Yeah.
too big. I mean, I think this question gets at what's happened in this world just in 2020. I mean, I look with great admiration at a lot of news organizations because, you know, it's seldom been the case that so many massively urgent, important currents were happening at the same time. And so I just don't think you have I think that this is just too hard to answer in a few phrases. It's everything. You know, you have to choose. Please, just.
Can I take a crack at it? Okay. First, I would commission a series of articles on disputed American elections, 1824, 1876, and 2000. You know, what happened. And the other thing about it is that these disputed elections tended to have very similar dynamics. Just so the public understands what disputed elections have looked like in the past. And then I would drill down in the counties that could go either way, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, certainly in Florida, maybe in Arizona. And I would have people really digging into the mechanics of how this election will play out. Who are the local election representatives here? If you have mail-in ballots, you know, what's going on with the postal facilities in these particular places? Where are these votes going to be counted? Who is in charge of that? What is that person's track record? Is that person elected or appointed? And if they are elected, you know, are they a Democrat or a Republican? And this, I think this election is going to look like those old, I'm dating myself here, but those old phone switchboards when, you know, people would call and they'd say, I'm going to put you through to this. And they have like lots of rows of switches and all those things. You know, whatever array of switches are in the off position versus the switches that are in the on position, it will likely yield whatever result that we're getting. And what I mean by that is, you know, what happened in this one small county versus what happened in this other county and those kinds of things. And you can actually look on a granular level, just to get back to Susan's point about how it was enlightening to me when we saw that there's been a decline overall in the application of the death penalty in most states, and only a handful of states where the death penalty is still really being deployed significantly. But it was the end of its rope. Brendan, what is Brendan's last name? I have it on my shelf. I'll come back to it. Anyway, the book, The End of Its Rope, which is about the death penalty, which pointed out that it was only a handful of counties, actually, in the United States that represented the overwhelming number of death penalty cases in the US. And so I think something like that an analysis like that along the lines of the election would be really useful.
There's a story I would love to see, but you don't have to be managing editor to do it. And I'm sure that this questioner had a much bigger macro global thing in mind. But what brings this to mind, many years ago, for some reason, I got offered $5 to be a Nielsen TV diarist. Like, I just spend, I don't know, like 2 or 3 weeks writing down everything I watched on TV for, you know, in like a little booklet, and I sent it in. And, you know, this is before they had boxes and stuff. It was actually kind of an eye-opening experience. And I would love to see in a real delineated way where certain people are getting their information on, like, for an entire week, not just he's a Fox News viewer. The truth is, a Fox News viewer, he's probably on Facebook, he's talking to friends at work, he's, you know, all that. There's like all this input coming in. And I feel like we in the media don't really understand it, that we have this kind of broad rubric of there's some crazy shit on Facebook, and so people who read it must be crazy. I'm sure some of them are. But, you know, how much that really seeps in, how much of it is just kind of like seeing alien headlines on the cover of the National Enquirer You go ahead and pick it up just because it's kind of fun and emotionally gratifying, versus how much of it really influences the way people are making decisions. So anyway.
Thank you for raising the point about journalists agreeing to switch off the cameras at the White House. I come from a country where I've seen the slow takeover of media houses by government interests through ad revenue or ownership changes. Do you feel there is a similar threat to American journalism and their freedoms, and how can we fight that?
I do believe there's a terrible threat to Americans and their freedoms. And I constantly think about other countries where, you know, I was directing coverage of things that, you know, we're writing about with alarm. And I will say that, you know, a number of prominent press figures at major news institutions have sounded that alarm. What we can do about it, because I am a nonpartisan journalist, so I'm not going to make a political call to arms. I think that, you know, I guess one thing I do feel heartened about is the News Literacy Project, which is sort of along the lines that Bill mentioned with his Colorado boyhood, you know, trying to help people see how the press can help them inform themselves and empower them to make the decisions that they want. But I do, you know, I'm also on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I think that's an important place to put direct resources to groups that actually try to support and protect and champion people who are threatened by draconian and undemocratic measures. And the Committee to Protect Journalists has spent much more of its attention on American issues than ever before in its history. And so there are other advocates, you know, legal and institutional, to support the institution of a press. And part of that, though, is to make it accountable to wider ranges of communities so that a broader range of people feel invested in a press that reflects them and their concerns.
And this, I guess this is a related question. Rather than play whack-a-mole with the agents of disinformation and their state sponsors, which won't stop them and could grant them outsized importance, would media reporting be more effective, influential, and societally useful when examining contentious issues by reporting about people working to find and trying solutions that focus beyond the divide that those propagandists, foreign and domestic, seek to weaponize? I guess it's saying, do you not kind of go after the individual claims of state sponsors of disinformation or people spewing disinformation wherever they come from, and report about the people working on solutions that focus beyond the division in the society?
I think the way that information spreads right now, it would be dangerous to let disinformation spread unchecked and unchallenged. But I don't think that means running down every single story, you know, every single false piece of information that gets bubbled up into the press and then putting it in a headline that doesn't refute the false information. I think it means clearly refuting the false information and then moving on to, you know, a real story. So I think there's, you know, it's important to challenge disinformation, but I do agree that the bulk of our time is much better spent looking elsewhere and not kind of letting the disinformation agents set the agenda for our newsrooms.
And I guess this question is following up on the point that Bill made. Will a subscription-based, we have 2 minutes left, so this will be the concise version of this. Okay. Will a subscription-based business model create an information divide?
I think there's a real risk of it, and I think that the way that you get around it is you think of a news organization a little bit like a symphony or an orchestra, where you have a certain amount of the revenue coming from people who go to the nightly concerts, but also you have some kind of a philanthropic base and hopefully an endowment that it enables that news to get delivered to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to see it or watch it or read it.
we have 1 minute left. We came in 1 minute under budget for this conversation. So I want to thank Ashton, Susan, and Bill for their participation. I also want to thank everyone who is with us as a viewer today and people who have contributed questions to, I think, this very insightful conversation. And here we have Kyle Pope. So I want to say thank you to everyone, and thank you for the invitation for me to participate today.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you guys. This was a really, really interesting conversation and a great way to end this 2-day conversation that we've been having. You gave us a lot of ideas that newsrooms can take to heart and think about how do we make sure that this just doesn't sort of float off. So thanks to all of you. Jelani, thank you for expert moderating. And thanks for everybody for being here. Stay up to date with CJR at cjr.org and through our daily email to media today as we keep following all of these issues here. Thank you again, and thanks to the panel.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. Bye now.